Russian troops and armaments were ordered into eastern Ukraine Monday, marking a drastic escalation in the conflict that's been ongoing since 2014, when Russia previously sent troops and arms into the area known as the Donbass and also annexed Crimea. President Vladimir Putin signed a directive to recognize breakaway states in eastern Ukraine, the so called People's Republics of Luhansk and Donetsk, and then deployed what he claimed are peacekeeping forces into the area. So far, no indication that the Russian military will press further into Ukraine, despite warnings from President Biden and unnamed U.S. security officials last week that Kiev would be targeted in an extremely brutal operation to repress, crush, and harm Ukrainians. Instead, it's more of the same conflict that's been going on for 8 years now, but with Russia trying to strengthen the hand of rebels in the separatist states. Even the White House conceded as much, telling reporters that Russia sending troops into the Donbass is not a new step, a position the White House first took in January. Now, this is still very early, and things can still go in a number of different directions. New sanctions are being readied by the US and European nations, and the Russian president is increasing his bellicose rhetoric toward the Ukrainian government. For those of us who don't like war, situation's not great. It's also entirely avoidable. There was a point not too long ago when US diplomats foresaw this exact scenario playing out in Ukraine. According to a 2008 State Department memo written by then Ambassador to Russia William Burns, who is now Joe Biden's CIA director, the US government was well aware of Moscow's security concerns should Ukraine pursue a path toward NATO membership and what the fallout might be. And I'm just going to read a portion of this memo, which was released by WikiLeaks in 2010. Quote, Ukraine and Georgia's NATO aspirations not only touch a raw nerve in Russia, they engender serious concerns about the consequences for stability in the region. Not only does Russia perceive encirclement and efforts to undermine Russia's influence in the region, but it also fears unpredictable and uncontrolled consequences which would seriously affect Russian security interests. So here's the State Department spelling it out in 2008 that Ukraine's NATO aspirations could have consequences for stability in the region. How exactly? Well, the memo continues, quote, experts tell us that Russia is particularly worried that the strong divisions in Ukraine over NATO membership, with much of the ethnic Russian community against membership, could lead to a major split involving violence or, at worst, civil war. In that eventuality, Russia would have to decide whether to intervene, a decision Russia does not want to have to face. Well, as they say, play stupid games, win stupid prizes, because knowing exactly what Russia would do in 2008, the U.S. State Department still pursued a policy in Ukraine to bring it closer to the West and one day into NATO. And now, here we are. Now, that doesn't absolve Russia of its decision to use military force in an attempt to redraw borders, a move of imperialism itself, but it does provide necessary context for how this extremely shitty situation has developed. In 2014, the U.S. supported a right-wing coup that led to the ouster of then-elected president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych. While exceedingly corrupt and openly supported by Moscow, Yanukovych did manage to keep friendly relations with the West. He spoke fondly of the European Union, had trade relationships, and coordinated on oil pipeline projects. He also kept close ties to Russia, leasing out a naval base in Crimea to its neighbor and making a commitment to not join NATO. The Yanukovych regime was toppled after months of protest and occupation in Maidan Square, outside the government headquarters. U.S. politicians like John McCain even attended the protests to lend support, fueling suspicions in the Kremlin that the U.S. was involved in the overthrow of Yanukovych. And while the opposition to Yanukovych was widespread, neo-Nazi gangs represented the leading edge of the street fights. Yanukovych fled when his security forces could no longer protect him, and a new government, heavily pushed by U.S. diplomats in Europe, was installed, which then immediately moved to bring Ukraine closer to the West. Some of the neo-Nazi elements that helped lead the revolution were incorporated into their own battalion in the Ukraine security state. As the 2008 State Department cable noted, the divisions in the country make governing Ukraine difficult. In the breakaway states today, a majority of the population is Russian, and Russian is the official language. They opposed the new coup leaders, protests broke out, and Russia began arming the regions, and soon there was war in eastern Ukraine. Several months into the fighting, a peacemaking agreement known as the Minsk II Protocol was negotiated, although the Ukrainian government never moved to implement the constitutional changes laid out in the agreement, and Russia's recognition now of rebel states as independent also violates the agreement, so it's essentially dead, even though it was never really alive. 8 years of conflict has not forced the government to reconsider its desire to join NATO. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky continued to pursue membership, and the U.S. continues to insist Ukraine has a right to join. Already, the Russian ruble is collapsing on news of just the peacekeeping force in the Donbass. Brutal, bloody struggle all the way to Kiev would inflict a serious toll on the Russian state and the Putin government in particular. It would also devastate Ukraine, and it would plunge Europe into an energy crisis. So, such a scenario should be avoided at all costs. And really, the only constructive role the U.S. can play here now is to pull back from its policy of brinksmanship around expanding NATO. 3 weeks ago, Russia submitted a proposal for de escalation that depended on a commitment that Ukraine would not join NATO and a prohibition on the U.S. deploying nukes and offensive weapons in Ukraine and the rest of Eastern Europe. The proposal was immediately rejected by the U.S. State Department, which has honestly very little to lose if things escalate and quite a bit to gain in the form of further isolation of a longtime adversary in the Kremlin, plus a raft of new weapons contracts for its defense sector. Just last week, a new $6 billion deal to sell tanks to Poland was announced. Condemnation of Putin has been fast and furious, but these harsh words and threats of retaliatory sanctions and even cyber attacks have not moved Moscow off its position that Ukraine must be prevented from joining NATO. As anti-imperialists in the U.S. who recognize the role NATO has played in advancing U.S. militarism and instability in places like Afghanistan and Libya, it should be pretty easy for the left to advocate for this concession, to push the Biden administration to pursue this diplomatic avenue. There is no other viable solution on the table at the moment, and anything else risks further escalating a war that could get out of hand very, very quickly. Hey, thanks for watching. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any of our new videos. Also, if you want to see Means Morning News in its complete form, not just the clips we post here, head on over to Means TV and get access to all our new episodes and our entire backlog, plus tons of other great movies and original TV shows.